Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Google Play, and a whole bunch of other venues. Just visit our sites, chimeraobscura.com/VM or vmspod.com to find more information, along with our RSS feed. And follow the show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod. I had a pretty good weekend, kind of recharging and transformational, if transformation's a thing one can experience, which is an ongoing question of mine and all of human life. But anyway, how it happened was, well, it was three ways. First, I recorded this week's show. I hadn't done a podcast in 3 weeks, and the lack of that sort of conversation was starting to make me weirder, but weird, kind of depressive, and not doing the things I should be doing. And I know that wasn't the sole reason, but it wasn't just good to get a talk in with somebody for the show. It was with someone I've recorded with a few times, so we were able to talk like friends, and that really mellowed me out in some ways. And then that evening, Saturday evening, Amy and I watched the first episode of Painting with John on HBO. It's a 6-episode unscripted series about the artist John Lurie. Just him talking to the camera, looking at the landscape and the horizon around his tropical home, and painting, primarily watercolors. And I found myself really creatively charged up after that. And I thought about how I'd like to draw and maybe play with watercolors and not feel any shame at being absolutely terrible at it. There's a certain liberation, I guess, to being 50, which is that you're not going to master something, and it's okay. So by the time I got up the next morning, I had this neat idea for a 4-panel comic for the next zine, based on a dream I had about Paracelsus and the 4 elements and my coffee making routine. Trust me, it all fits together. So I'm trying to figure out if I can draw that myself or get someone to draw it for me. But I'm thinking of making stuff. And not just writing or, well, whatever. Anyway, I spent a chunk of Sunday cleaning and rearranging my office, ostensibly to find a sketch pad I bought a couple of years ago. But once the process got rolling, I realized it was really about reframing my brain. And then in the evening, we watched the movie In and of Itself, which just came out on Hulu. And I'm not going to tell you anything about it. And I hope you watch it as soon as possible. And I hope you don't look up anything about it before you watch it. All I'm going to say is In and of Itself. It's on Hulu. It's an hour and a half. Just have a blank slate and an open mind when you start. So that was also an energizing experience, which I'm not going to get into because you should experience it in your own way. And that was Sunday night. And even though it shot me into a work week that is filled with heavy-duty stuff I have to deal with, including a big FDA meeting this afternoon, I feel a lot more ready to tackle it and then figure out how to draw some of the trees in my backyard, which really deserve to be drawn. Nobody's ever drawn them as far as I know. And they deserve it after all these years. I also, over the weekend, finally settled down and started lining up guests for this spring. And I went through various publishers' upcoming catalogs and reached out to publicists, get some names into the great spreadsheet that knows all, so I could start filling in some of those calendar spots. And we'll see the results of that soon. I did have a very funny experience, though. I got a yes from the writer and Harvard professor Louis Menand for his new book, The Free World, Art and Thought in the Cold War. And I was really happy because just on the strength of the title, much less Menand's pedigree, this looks like a great one. But last night, after confirming that we were going to record sometime in March or early April for the book, I noticed that the book is 880 pages long. So I wrote him a follow-up email. So that page count, that includes the index in the notes, right? And he said it did, and the text was only 700-something pages, but quote-unquote, it's a real page-turner, Gil. Anyway, that's for April. Right now, you get the conversation that helped get me out of my depressive spiral. Our guest is Sven Birkerts, who has a new book out called Vladimir Nabokov's Speak Memory, bookmarked. It's from IG Publishing, and that's IG. It's a study of Nabokov's memoir, which in itself is a joy to read. And as I mentioned during the conversation, I only got around to it this fall. But Sven, in the bookmarked book he has out now, does this wonderful job of exploring what it is that makes Speak Memory a towering achievement of memoir. And he explores it from a variety of angles, prose, technical construction, the nature of memory and story, his own experience with memoir, and in the coda, this wonderful sort of exploration of what memory and history is through some of his own experiences. And it's written with deep love, and it forms a beautiful complement to Nabokov's work. And for all the ways he teases out how Speak Memory does its magic, he never ceases to marvel over it and the magic itself of Nabokov's writing. And there's a bit in there about certain aspects of it that he might chide a young writer for doing, but turn out to be carefully constructed elements of Nabokov's work that make Speak Memory unforgettable, as it were. And this complement to it, a really, really excellent piece of work. Now, it is the first book I've read in IG's bookmarked series, but on the strength of it, I plan to check more of them out. Like I say, Sven manages to relay not just the magic of Nabokov's memoir, but the magic of reading it and experiencing it, and of returning to it at different stages of life. So go check out Vladimir Nabokov's Speak Memory, bookmarked. But if you haven't read Speak Memory yet, go do that first. It's wonderful. Now here's Sven's bio. Sven Birkerts has been co-editor of the literary magazine Agni since July 2002. Among his previous books are Changing the Subject, Art and Attention in the Internet Age, The Other Walk, Art of Time and Memoir, Then Again, Reading Life, Books for the Ages, American Energies, Essays on Fiction, The Gutenberg Elegies, The Fate of Reading in an Electronic Age, Readings, and My Sky Blue Trades, Growing Up Counter in a Contrary Time. He was winner of the Citation for Excellence in Reviewing from the National Book Critics Circle and the Spielvogel-Diamonstein Award from Penn for the Best Book of Essays. He was a director of the Bennington Writing Seminars from 2007 to 2017 and has been a member of the core faculty since its founding in 1994. Which, given that last week's guest, Mark Wunderlich, is the current director of the Bennington Writing Seminars, makes the second consecutive director of Bennington Writing Seminars to appear on the show. Sven's new book is Vladimir Nabokov's Speak Memory, bookmarked. And now, the 2021 Virtual Memories Conversation with Sven Birkerts. I know it's part of the intro for the book, but tell us how Vladimir Nabokov's Speak Memory, bookmarked, came about for you.
Well, as I write in that intro, I had been invited to be on a panel about the craft of the essay in Newport. And the woman who invited me...
The panel was in Newport. It wasn't about the memoir in Newport, right?
Right.
Okay, just making sure.
Oh, right. And
That's subgenre of Newport memoirs. But anyway, go
yeah,
on.
so this woman, Alden Jones is her name. She's a Bennington grad and a Boston literary presence. Anyway, after we did our stint in front of a group of students, she took me and one other person out for oysters. And we were having a great conversation around the table, and it was the usual, what are you up to? Which I asked her, and she said, oh, I'm, finishing this book on Cheryl Strayed. And I said, well, that's interesting. You mean a whole book? She said, yeah, there's this series, and it's not bookmarked. It's an analogous series. But she said, yeah, they give you a whole book to talk about your involvement with a particular author and book and how that book has infiltrated you, as books sometimes will, and shaped you, and, all those interesting things. And I immediately perked up in a very big way, because I really had been walking around for quite a while with the what's next cloud hovering over my head. And I didn't think it was possible that a person could be turned loose on a book, free to write about it. And so I said that to her, and she said, well, you should look at this other place, IG Publishing, and they're running a series, and Steve Almond had done one on Stoner, and so I thought that sounds pretty reputable. So as soon as I got home, I wrote the editor, Bob Lasner, just to ask if such a thing were possible. And in the age of instantaneity, this is a few hours after our lunch, he was already back to me saying, sounds interesting. What do you want to pitch? And I sort of lead into the book with that question, which the minute he said that, I said, oh, geez. I began to sort of look and think, well, there's this guy, this author, this book. And it seemed an overabundance, because I have so many authors that fit that description, who've been with me, 40, 50 years as literary companions of some sort, or influences, and I was getting really flummoxed until I said, why don't I approach this the other way? Rather than trying to think of a book, why don't I think of where I am in the world now, in my life, and my preoccupations? And why don't I see, if I lay those out, if an author kind of shows up, announces him or herself. And that too is fairly immediate. The minute I said, well, spend so much time thinking about memory, and spending time always, thinking about sentences, just literary prose and various other things. And Nabokov stood up from his chair and came over and said, why don't you write about me? And this is a book I had, again, I don't want to retail everything that's in there, but it's a book that had traveled with me in various ways and had various subjective uses for me over the course of my reading life. Mm-hmm. And I immediately saw that because of that, and inside of that, there was possibility enough to write a book-length, reflection, because this was not going to be lit crit. This was not going to be analysis. And the whole point is to write subjectively as a reader/writer, and to open, how this book basically made its place in your life.
Yeah. And
the minute I named that and recognized it, and I wrote probably the same day, being anxious like you, afraid of losing the fish on the hook. I don't know who was the fish, but I pitched that, asked if anyone had done it. He said no, it was wide open. Gave me a basic word count and a basic deadline, which was, we're talking about the very end of August of whatever year that was, but the deadline was January of 20. So yeah.
Really compelled. So really, the tight deadline, though, compelled you to really narrow in a focus like that?
Yeah, I mean, whoever it was, I think, was it Dostoevsky who said, or Samuel Johnson, maybe, the prospect of a firing squad concentrates the mind wonderfully. Yeah, this was what I wanted. I wanted something to pitch into. I wanted a, fixed kind of constraint of time, because I reviewed for decades and decades, and I got used to the constraint model of writing, which then I sort of left behind once I went into the more sort of reflective essay, kind of the see where it goes essay. But all those years of reviewing left that reflex there. So as soon as I knew I had that deadline, I probably was making notes the same night somewhere, and
I shudder to ask, if they'd gotten back to you and said, "Oh, we've already got someone doing speak memory," did you have a second thought?
Sure, I had quite a roster, but each one was for a different sort of
self.
A different self, and the Nabokov overlapped several of the selves. But, I had thought of Cortázar, who had been one of the early instigators for me. I thought of Walker Percy. I thought of Marguerite Yourcenar. I had quite a list there. But, fortunately it hadn't been taken. And, so then the project becomes at that point, okay, how on earth does one proceed? Both, on the one hand, juggling the whole range of the personal, and on the other is, doing justice to the book, not just having it be about myself and whatever excitements I had around that literary experience, but also to try to probe into what made that engine run, which was really the fascination, because, I just had a reflexive, natural adoration of not all of Nabokov, but much of Nabokov. Mm-hmm. But it's kind of like sometimes you just trust that you really like or love something, and then when you start looking at it, you begin to understand that there are components to that reaction.
And I'd only read Speak Memory for the first time last fall, and I had that, I know I have to go back and visit it, and having this book now as a companion to it, being able to break down some of those components and the things that that unfolded for me in the course of reading it, now seeing how some of it snaps together, and even things that, as you put it, would have gotten bad marks if you saw it in a student's paper. And
right.
Yet you had it's Nabokov, gonna trust him that this wasn't, haphazard. This is carefully crafted and put this way for a reason.
Exactly. I think it's probably good that you, not good, but it makes sense that you would come to it at this point, sort of in a more adult fashion. It's not a book that would necessarily grab a 20 or 30-year-old. It might, because the prose itself is so wonderful just to read along with. But the themes, things that have been lost, memory, exile, all of that, those are they resonate and sort of they mature, I think, depending on your life and what you come to feel. Once you acquire a past, see, if you're 20, you haven't really taken ownership of a past. It's kind of, it's mostly you're looking forward, and there's some stuff that happened. When you're like 50 plus, it all changes. There's a new light on it. And, I think it becomes more and more live as you get farther from it.
Oh, this is my story about the leopard, the Lampedusa novel.
Love that book. Yes.
It sat on my shelf for 10 years. And then I read it at 40 or 41 and thought, thank God. Thank God I didn't read this at 30 or younger. Would not have made an impression on me in the slightest until in my 40s. Then I'm like, oh, loss, mortality. I understand these concepts and what it means to see the world passing by and your static place within it. So, yeah, the weird aspect of speak memory for me, I know this is absolutely personal and esoteric, but for some reason, I kept getting stuck with this geographic memory of a particular street in Annapolis, Maryland, where I got my graduate degree at St. John's when I was 23, 24 years old. I had not read any Nabokov outside of Lolita at that point. I do not understand for the life of me why every time I opened the book, I just kept getting this moment of that particular street in Annapolis. I'm like, at some point I have to go back there and figure out if there's some geographic connotation or something that wedged in my brain half my life ago that made me think this memoir is coming for me. But
is it an arbitrary street in Annapolis, or is a street fraught with whatever you haven't yet fully identified?
It's a street that had bookstores, the smoke shop where I used to hang out with my best friend to get cigars. It was, one of the really nice streets that we used to hang out in. But I do not recall anyone ever discussing this book, nothing about it. But every time I would start, and then once you make that association, it keeps coming back.
Right.
I would just hit with this again and again. I'm like, it's the untold mysteries of how did you time, memory, and the search for meaningful patterns in life that you refer to in the book is Nabokov's.
Well, yeah. I mean, now that you brought up that phrase, I mean, I think that is. It's subjectively so very central, and it's also, I wonder how to phrase this, it's a little bit literarily unhip. It's unhip in a way to believe that there is a compelling personal meaning, not a larger over meaning, but that one can arrive through the course of one's life at a place where, as Saul Bellow said, it all adds up. And Nabokov trades on that and does it so brilliantly, because when you look at a life not through the screen of chronology or what happened, but when you look at your own life through whatever the optic of what really stayed with you, what mattered, and how that grows and changes over the course of the ongoing years. I mean, I'm pledged to the idea that I'm just not going to, I hope I'm not wrong here, but I'm not just going to lie down at some point and close my eyes without closure. I guess that's almost a pun, but some kind of psychological closure and all the clues that, or all the things that come together to affect closure.
You're much more optimistic about the state of or shape of your life than I am about mine, certainly. But I mean, that brings up a question that I have. In the course of the book, you talk about writing your own memoir as you were approaching 50, and how speak memory helped you understand what memoir was and how it works as opposed to other forms. I have to say, I just turned 50 2 weeks ago, and my impulse is that my life is less and less worthy of trying to capture in prose. So I'm interested in that idea that, as you were closing in, you felt that this is, that you wanted to figure out aspects of your life.
We should discuss worthiness here, because when you say that, my first reaction is, oh, you're looking back to see if there are the cumulative events of a really, interesting story with big themes. Whereas I think one of the takeaways from Nabokov, he's not the only one from whom, there are these takeaways, but it's the whole business of attention and detail. And that was what was so both eye-opening and liberating to me when I was writing, was the thought that you could condense a whole part of your childhood from a memory of being, underneath the couch watching the sun make a pattern against the cloth and hearing your parents in the other room talking, which is literally, it's an utterly banal moment. But if you can create the consciousness of yourself in that moment, that becomes an event, a literary event for yourself, I mean. And so anything can become interesting if you look at it. I'm stealing that from Flaubert, but I truly believe that. I think stare at anything for a while and it begins to widen the context, and you're suddenly not just looking at the doorknob that I'm looking at right now, but I'm looking at a door. I'm looking at a door in my house, which I'm moving out of next week, Saturday, after 30 years.
Which we'll talk about later on, because I do have questions about that too.
Yeah, so I mean, his genius is not to just say, well, there are all these illuminated particular moments, but taking it one step further with the suggestion that they may make a theme that would only be relevant to the person who experienced those moments, but a theme nonetheless. Which is, I realize we're talking very sort of obscurely. These are not things one can name. And if you're talking about the idea of whether as you round the final bend, whether there is something you can genuinely recognize as meaning, which in a way is, you want to arrive there because then it's all been okay. And if you get to the end and if you're just looking out the window and there's, a vast nothingness out there, that's a different story. So it's worth for me pursuing the former option as far as I can, on the trust that it may be true.
So what did writing this book teach you about speak memory? Because we've talked about what speak memory taught you about memoir, in a sense.
Well, and to pick one of the levels, it taught me something I needed to recognize it as deeply as I finally maybe could. And that was just, well, when I said earlier that sometimes you just say, well, you love something and you don't quite break open the shell and figure out why. One of the reasons, so it was kind of a lesson and a discovery, was just if you start to press down on the prose, and I spend quite a few pages pressing down on prose in the middle of that book, but that really begins to reveal, it's not just, oh, that's a nice sentence, but you see that the sentence has an architecture, and you see that many, many things come together to make it have that form and to, create that response. And for me, the effect of that is not just the effect of, the pleasure of some kind of analysis, but it reawakens my my whole relation to language in writing, to sentence making. It becomes exciting to me again once I can generate excitement around someone else's sentences, which you lose as a teacher because most of the sentences you're looking at aren't taking you there, But when you read something that's just top notch, I don't think anyone writes a better sentence, or probably some people do, but it's a small group. There's a huge amount to be taken from that. And so I was going to say, and that feeds into my own writing impulse, which needs as much feeding as it can get these days.
Yeah, I wondered about the intimidation factor, I guess, of writing about someone whose prose. I always use incandescent to describe Nabokov's prose, but I know there's so many other terms you can use.
That's a good one, though. That's a good one.
Yeah, I also use it for when Martin Amis was most in his Nabokovian phase back in the 80s. But anyway, that's a separate tangent that I'll get into later on. But yeah, that I would say challenge, or and I suppose this characterizes me as an individual more than normal people, that fear of not doing the prose justice in how you're writing about it, I guess.
Well,
not to make you think about, how challenging it is or make you look down and see the
I think that is more true if you're dealing with someone who's sort of, you feel, in a certain scale of excellence. With somebody who you place as high as they place Nabokov, it's liberating to write about him because there's no thought or question that I'm trying to sort of compete to nudge him out of the way to do the Harold Bloom, thing. He's safe, and one can just, admiration can be there without the necessary and customary subconscious competition that is, they're evaluating and talking about most any other writer.
And, one of the things that, and you get into it in terms of not just the crafting of the sentences, but the crafting of the book and, the various technical ways it's put together. The notion of a memoir coming from a writer for whom games and puzzles and mazes, in a sense, are so predominant. That sense, I guess, that the memoir might be not a fiction, but a trap of sorts, like Pale Fire in a weird way.
Yeah. But how do you relate that to Speak Memory, the trap factor?
It's one of those things. I just wonder how much you trust a writer who revels in, I would say, playing games. We'll use as a shorthand with the reader.
Well, I do, but not because of the games. The thing that I came to, and I write about it a little bit, is I came to understand his lepidoptery, his maniacal chess, obsession, and in general, his sort of detail-oriented structural game-playing fascinations. That's not at all what pulls me to Nabokov. What pulls me is the underlying sorrow that everything is running like a river underneath it. And my feeling was that he took to those particular things because they were so obsessively occupied his intelligence. They sort of fixed it, or as they used to say in Freudian terms, cathected it. They were kind of stay against the emotion, which you feel is right there on the other side of that near transparent wall, membrane or whatever. But he keeps himself one step ahead of his exile, sort of nostalgic heartbreak with these activities. It needs to be something that rigorous in order to structure him so that he's not, plus writing, of course. Writing is the ultimate artifice in that sense. You write about your reality, but in doing so, you're writing to stave it off at the same time. So,
Yeah, there's so many threads that on one side came out of reading the memoir itself and then reading your book on it. Just as you mentioned, chess. You may recall, as we've talked about the last time we got together, my fixation on Stefan Zweig's chess story. And,
the Royal Game.
Yeah, and the weird parallel of these two men who were exiled, one of whom managed to function in America, and the other who just couldn't take it and bugged out, goes to Brazil and ends up committing suicide, but for whom his final, and I think one of his greatest works, is this way a man's life can fall into a chessboard, basically, and become one of the problems he's trying to solve.
So in a sense, on the one hand is chess as a recourse toward maintaining some kind of sanity. And in the other case, in the Zweig, it's the path to a madness because finally it overwhelms, the intelligence. Yeah, that's so interesting. Are you a chess player?
No, I did when I was a kid because
me too.
Because computers weren't smart enough at that point. You could still figure out how to beat them. And when I was a kid, it was the 70s, you could beat them, at least home computers. Once they got smarter, I kind of got dumber. So.
Yeah, well, they beat us at everything now. There's no recourse but just to enjoy ourselves.
I would say they don't do conversation well, but I actually had this this embarrassing moment that I haven't related yet to anyone but my wife, but I figure no one's listening, so I'll tell you. The week of my birthday, I got a call from someone wishing me a happy birthday, and I had the incoming number, but I didn't know who it was. And when he was introducing himself, it was just the moment when I was putting my AirPods in, so I didn't catch the name. But I knew he was someone I knew from work. And I knew him well enough that we were talking familiarly, but I literally went an entire half hour without knowing who I was talking to and kept him going the entire time. Like it was like a reverse Turing test. I was like,
exactly.
Yeah.
I was just,
I'm like, I'm dumb enough not to know who this person is, but I can still fake human conversation well enough that it just, as long as I don't say anything too specific where I might get caught out, I think I'm going to be good. This person's in Toronto. That's all I know. And I went from that. After like 2 minutes from the end, I thought, oh, let me plug that phone number into my email and search. Oh my God, it's Raj. Holy crap. I should have known this. But yeah,
that's great.
Yeah. It's not great actually, because
it's a great story.
if I ever start the Alzheimer's decline, it's going to be terrible because I will be able to fake it for a while. And then it's going to be that much worse when we didn't diagnose it early because I was pretending I knew everyone I was talking to. So this is what preoccupies me at 50. So we'll talk about that.
Well, there's the faking it, and then there's the workaround, which is not really faking, but it's creating a path that sort of supplies the needed thing, but it's not the thing you need to remember, but you find a way, exerting much more energy in order to come to the same.
Oh yeah, and that conversation was exhausting. Figuring out how to keep this guy going without ever saying, "I'm sorry, who is this again?" Because that would have embarrassed me even more. And my wife said, "Why didn't you just ask?" I'm like, because the moment I got the AirPods in and he mentioned his name, he talked for like 2 more minutes, and so I couldn't interrupt him after that and ask who it was. So I figured I'd be polite and just play, generic the entire time. Anyway, that's the person you're unfortunately. This is Sven, right? No, I mean, this is the person you're
I'll remind you every few minutes who we're talking about and to.
Good to know. But the thing that, along with the Nabokov Zweig connection, one of the things that really struck me in the original memoir, and again, as you start to relate some of the after the events of Speak Memory itself, Nabokov in America, how absolutely strange it is, that era of America that he was here.
Oh,
yeah. And I know there's a book on it. I haven't read it yet, but I find myself utterly captivated by this idea of that former aristocrat, again, incandescent writer in America in the post-war era as we're turning into whatever America was turning into in those years.
That is what I most love about Lolita. I mean, there are many things, but it's the road trip and the occasion that it offers for him to sort of look at everything in that period's sort of panorama. All those, weird motels they check into, which are off from the side of the highway, and the school committee activity. It all resonates of the 50s that I remember. Yeah, he got that so well, and he had such an eye, and he was so unpersuaded by the whitewash of the great American mythos. He could see it through Humbert's lens is that of the European sophisticate, which clearly Nabokov was too. Which sounds, when you think about it a little, it sounds elitist would be the tag immediately applied, and justifiably it is a elitist, but it also allows an incisiveness, a kind of estranged incisiveness, and the estrangement comes from the fact that the person is just culturally of a slightly more developed stature, which makes him strange, and through that he can look at the world. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's what came into my head just now.
Oh yeah, no, it's one of the things I find fascinating about the book, although it does raise the question, does Lolita survive in this era? If you know what I mean?
I absolutely know what you mean.
Yeah.
I think Lolita, for many, has become a closet vice. I mean, something can survive quite vigorously and yet publicly sort of, that's been true of many things, but I think it's true of Lolita. You don't want to publicly give any sense of that, you give any validation at all to the premise
Right.
of the book. But you just can't get away from the writing.
Yeah.
You would not toss the book. You would hide it under your mattress.
Yeah. Caitlin Moran has this wonderful piece in The Guardian about, I think it was just influential books in her life, and mentions Lolita and says, if not for the premise, people would be quoting Lolita at weddings, and the professions of love and everything else within it are so beautiful and so well crafted that it would make all the sense in the world to do that, except you can't because it's Lolita. It's just.
And I guess people glom too quickly onto the salacious and inappropriateness of the premise, but the end of the book is such a piece of remorse and a kind of private atonement for all of those things that we're busy deploring. It's sort of encoded in the novel as well. He's very much aware of what he has done. He grieves it. It's just, it's heartbreaking at the end for that very reason.
Do you find other? Oh, sorry. Go on.
I was just going to say, there's a moment very near the end where Humbert is parked and he gets out of the car, and in the distance he hears the voices of children playing on a playground, and it just lays him low because it's suddenly that innocence is coming through the air to him, and he realizes, not for the first time, that innocence that he's sort of destroyed. So yeah, you were going to ask something. Sorry.
Yeah, no. Whether there are other authors who've become similar, maybe non-teachable based on student sensitivities over the years.
Well, these days it's really hard to see how far the list goes. I mean, it started with Huckleberry Finn a few years ago, and
sure.
It's like, I guess I'm very glad that I am far from teaching undergrad literature in any context, because everyone I know who teaches, and everyone I know teaches, and they're all at certain times of the year preparing their upcoming syllabi. And they're doing it almost entirely through the lens of creating as correct a mosaic of choices as possible. I mean, good literature within that sort of, whatever you want to use, the constraint. So, I mean, the idea is that you first determine what is the kind of image of representation that you need to have, and then you fill in the authors rather than going the other way. and that's a big change, I mean, you couldn't really teach Saul Bellow easily now, though we can't throw him out. But Philip Roth is getting poked at.
I got that question from another guest who said, I don't think Philip Roth will survive another 10 years because of that, not because of his literary merit.
Right. Well, that's, when you think that it's quite possible that, I don't know that Portnoy was ever classroom fodder, but
yeah.
I have a feeling it will never show up in a classroom again, not to mention various other works. Certainly Shylock is not about to show up,
I'm a big Sabbath theater mark, but yeah, I can understand why 18 to 21-year-old Gil wouldn't have gotten it exactly along the same lines of
right.
what we were talking about earlier. I think anything from the last 20 plus years of Roth is more, I don't want to say old man reading, but, mature, I guess, in terms of what you need to have experienced.
You come up, I mean, there's been a huge turn against David Foster Wallace, in part literary, but in part because of rumors or tales from his private life. Mm-hmm. He's been sort of, I see it more and more. He's kind of gone from being a generational hero to being X'd out to the margins. I think something like Martin Amis, for instance, so much of the rollicking, Martin Amis of earlier work is now, it's on the cusp, I would say, in terms of teachability, which is different from readability. But teachability sets the pace.
What people end up wanting to read as they get older. Yeah. Amos canceled on me, I would say famously, but nothing about my life is famous, canceled on me 3 days before our show, which left me a little peeved. But
that's a shame. That's a shame.
I do have to say, well, it's weird because he had this giant auto novel, Inside Story, that wasn't well received here, but apparently was fine in the UK.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting because what I was dying to ask him, the book focuses on Larkin, Bellow, and Hitchens and his relationships with them and their deaths. And Nabokov is almost completely absent. But to someone who's read Amos for years and years, Nabokov is clearly lying behind everything.
Oh, yeah.
For Amos, like Claire Quilty in Lolita or Kinbote in Pale Fire, that he's this figure that's there the whole time that we're not directly seeing. But
doesn't he even have a title, Visiting Mrs. Nabokov?
Yeah, he's written about the relationship.
No, he has often and well. It's true. It's interesting that those three writers that you name, Hitchens, Larkin, and who's the third?
Bellow,
of course, yeah. They're all, again, they're over on the margins themselves. So he, who is walking a wire a little bit, is writing about all these friends, and and it can't be devalued because he writes about them so well, and they had all of them so much depth to offer in their complexity and in some of their regrettable attributes as well. But these are people who actually bring something to the serious table, who actually, I mean, for years, I've never done it. I've been wanting to kind of take on that question, but take it on using Larkin as the centerpiece. Yeah. Precisely because, he has just written some of the most demonstrably beautiful poetry. Wits and Weddings, for example, is just, it's a poetic marvel. It reveals, it reveals a full sensibility that has its antennae out in every direction and is clearly deeply, deeply human. And then you realize that, he was a nasty man behind the scenes, but reconciling nasty man and brilliant writer. I guess that's been true for a long time, whether it's Ezra Pound or the Eliot business. Cynthia Ozick went after Eliot big time for his views, and yet he has shaped so much of the at least Western outlook for several generations. I mean, it's a deep question, and I just don't know if it's a question that leads to an answer or if we always just end up anxiously hovering, not sure where to go.
It's certainly, it defines our quote unquote cancel culture era, where we can look at, that guy was a shitheel, but oh my God, created phenomenal either prose, poetry, or TV, whatever it is.
We can throw out most of 60s and 70s rock and roll on the same basic premise.
Certainly. And
we're left with nothing.
As much as I love David Bowie, there were some questionable activities with non-consensual age people in his life, and we gloss over that because we love his music. But it's it's a big question. But the survival of Lolita and the sensitivities, I guess, of people. I don't know. I mean, to me, it's almost a fear of it's going to sound awful, and I'll get lambasted for this. A fear of greatness, fear of really engaging great art, and a fear of calling something great.
Well, that's very big now in the generation, for example, that my 26-year-old son is in. Greatness is a bugaboo. I mean, he's studying composition and music, and there's this great turn against the great esteemed German composers. It's the great man theory is out the window. And when that happens, it really messes up the canon in both directions. It also would have to be the great woman too, by extension. Sure. It's greatness itself, or the perception of greatness, and the elitism that is embedded in and presupposes, because it's hierarchical, and hierarchy is no-go. So, we're left in an interesting position on those grounds anyway.
Yeah. So, as you were approaching 50, you wanted to write a memoir. When you were approaching 70, did you face a similar impulse? Or a different way of trying to encapsulate? Or
I would say different. I mean, approaching 50, I isolate a very specific image that sort of encapsulates the impulse, which is that things no longer happened singly for themselves. They so very often resonated against things in the past. Mm-hmm. So I was having a different kind of experience. Everything sort of had prior connections and memories that went back relating to whatever it was. Now it's approaching 70. I'm not quite there yet, but I'm just utterly enthralled to, well, I guess memory, speak memory, speak Sven. And I'm hardly at all interested in the memory. Anything that'll say happened after 50. There's plenty to remember, but those things don't count in the same way as memories for me. I'm interested in the sort of
more primal
ones, more primal, the ones that actually gave my psyche the shape it has, whatever that is. Mm-hmm. And it's the same. That's what I recognized in Nabokov. He didn't write about anything much after his age of, early 20s. That person disappears. He's only there invisibly as the considerably older author in America reflecting back. But I like, for instance, I'm very taken by a writer like Sebald. I was
going to ask, given the occasional use of photos in Speak Memory.
Yeah. I very much admire Andre Aciman for his essays, not so much for his novels, but his essays, which just take on memory as the massively important subject that it is. And obviously Proust is in there, but Proust doesn't take on memory. He activates it. I mean, the whole book, the remembrance or the search for lost time or whatever we call it now, it's just a memory start to finish pretty much. And then there's remembering within the memory, but all of it is a memory. Yeah. And that's fascinating too. But, that happens, at a certain point, you're doing less and less in your actual day that marks you, that stands out as a shaping activity, though maybe moving will be one. You just go on. You found your great, broad, happy rut that you move along in, but then you remember back. And to get onto the moving theme, I mean, the last 3-4 weeks has been packing, and packing is,
the only thing I care about. How did you approach the books? What did you look at? What goes? What gets in the storage?
I gave away hundreds and hundreds of really good books, books that I just knew they were not going to enter into my thinking, writing life anymore. I had read them. I was happy to clear some space. I mean, I've kept thousands, Everyone is a decision. And with everyone you look at, there's the, well, maybe moment,
Yep.
And I got that just about. I had to really become cruel with and to myself. The bigger thing, the books are big, but the bigger thing was actually papers. I discovered how many boxes of letters I had tightly packed. And each one obviously then becomes a little window onto that moment in your life, where you're living and who you're writing to, who's writing to you, what you're saying or what's being said to you by somebody else. I can't get rid of any of that. And I can't get rid of photographs for the same reason. I mean, family photographs.
Sure.
So all of this is becoming this great stew. So, in a way, there's, especially with COVID, there's not much going on within the practical day, but the other sphere has opened wide, and it's just full of all this undigested, possibly never will be digested content. All these years, 30 years in a house where you tend to be a person who doesn't throw things out is just mind-boggling.
I've been in this house for almost 50 years. Most of my 50 I've spent in the house I'm currently in. And as you can imagine, there are stacks of notebooks and other stuff, most of which only have a few pages filled in. But how could I possibly throw them out? They have to keep stacking up.
That's so interesting because, yes, the notebook with, 10 pages in it and then the rest blank, I guess it's telling the story of starts that one makes. This notebook is my new life. I'm going to start. Here's what I'm going to do now with my life. And then there's the sputter.
It's only in the last 2 or 3 years that I focusedly, I found the type of notepad or notebook. And I every morning, at least a page or two in the journal, and those are now stacking up, and they're actually full from beginning to end. But that was a freaky moment for me. Like, oh my God, the last page. I've never seen this before. This is great.
Well, tell me about that notebook, because this is also a big issue with.
Well, I'll email you. It's I discovered it by accident. I write on graph.
I was just going to ask that.
Yeah, I don't like lines. I prefer graph lines instead. And I found this weird and of course, because I'm insane, this is what I'll tell you. I was headed to a podcast in Washington, D.C. and stopped in a little menswear boutique and found this this type of notepad, this little sized and pocket-sized cardboard covers from a French paper maker called Calipino, and fell in love with these pads. And then a few years later, I decided, let me start using those as a journal. I now, it's a little like Bruce Chatwin, but I'm obviously, there are many differences between me and Bruce Chatwin. We won't get into it, but I just order, a dozen of these notebooks at a time, and they just ship from France, even in pandemic era.
Well, the French, they're not notebooks, they're cahiers, right?
Yeah.
I also believe if you find the absolute right paper and notebook and the absolute right pen, anyone could become Tolstoy or whoever. It's just a matter of those two things.
I used to refer to that as acquisitive alchemy. It's the same thing that kept me from doing the podcast for so long. I just need to get the right microphone and the right this and the right that. Eventually I realized that's all your neurotic bullshit, Gil. You need to actively make something or just write something. But it is nice having settled on that one particular thing, and I can just, I know what they're going to be like. The lines might be lined up a little bit differently from book to book, but every morning after I finish my coffee, come downstairs and write a page or two. And
flexible covers,
cardboard, not super flex. They'll fit in a pocket and you can walk around. So yeah, I just leave them on this desk, and inside the drawer of the desk, it is every 6 weeks, basically, I finish filling one up, and they are just stacking and stacking now over 2+ years. But the nice thing is they're almost completely unreadable because my handwriting is grotesque, especially at that hour. So nobody will ever be able to decipher, the Gil Roth papers, which, again, goes to my life that people shouldn't really be looking into.
I want you to promise me here and now that the next time you do one of your notebook reflections online, you give us a picture of one of these books.
I'll do that.
Or a stack of them or something.
Oh, yeah. I've posted a picture of these, a stack of the actual notebooks filled, because I write the opening and closing dates on them. But this is of a piece with me as a failure as a writer, which we can go into anytime. The way when I was young, I would read those Paris Review Writers at Work interviews as though there was some clue that would unlock, or some key that would unlock the, this is how one writes, as opposed to writing, which, always fail to just sit down and do. So, and then you put too much pressure on yourself, and then you find that you're 50 and a lobbyist to the pharmaceutical industry, and things just go in a very different direction than you thought.
Well, you're only 50, Bill.
Now, one of the things also, in addition to the use of photos and the Sebald connection in Speak Memory, that captivated me, and it's part of my failure as a writer also, because I'm still intimidated by the lack of acceptance by my parents, the notion of being a figure in someone else's book. Something that you went through when you were writing about other people in your memoir, and something that you explore in how Nabokov particularly approaches both of his parents.
Yeah. That, we seem to be coming up against all of the great vexing questions of our time, because you have to grant that, I think I have some aside in there to this effect that, it's true that, whatever portrait you're going to make as a writer of anyone else is going to be utterly false and objectionable to the person, if only because the person doesn't see him or herself like that. But if you took that away, you have to grant that freedom in order for our vocation to exist, at least the nonfiction portion of it. It's the sort of, and it tightens the task. It makes getting it right, or trying to get it as right as possible, becomes the real challenge. But you can never satisfy anyone, that you've written about. Even if you're falling all over yourself praising them, I don't think anyone would quite recognize themselves in the words of another.
Yeah. But how cognizant were you? How much did you know that intellectually versus how much did you then experience when you wrote the memoir and it came out?
It was all after the fact. I naively believed that I had rendered everything just as it should be rendered. And I don't think there was a single person who I still know who was in there who didn't find some grounds for reproach. If only the reproach of, you barely wrote about me for a page. There's that kind of reproach, and then there are all the other personality types. And yeah.
You didn't write about me enough. Why did you write about me in this way? Those are two.
Yeah. That's it right there. Yep.
It's funny because when I put out that zine I did last year, the only fictional piece is about my mother, sort of, or at least has references to my mother in it. And I've never sent it to her because I'm convinced she will think this is nonfiction, the way everybody who read it felt that it was nonfiction and thought this was the most, not savage, but the funniest thing they read. I'm like, that's the thing I made up. And yet, because I said my mother, you guys all took this as, this must be, Gil's honest rendition of his mom.
I don't know how much making up there is finally.
Oh,
there's
no.
Concealment
it's pretty accurate.
But yeah.
Yeah. But I want to, just approach one line of speak memory and everything we've talked about in terms of what memory is and what memoir is. And for all of the glorious prose of Nabokov and everything he brings into it and all the ways he constructs scenes and puts it all together, he has this one moment, and we know the later parts of the book are spoken, what's narrated to his wife, Vera. And he just has this one line where he writes, "Nobody will know what you and I know."
Right.
And of everything else I highlighted in that book, that was the one that caught me up the most. That for everything else, all the beauty and the sense of everything that's in there, and yet there's still, this is everything nobody will ever really know about us in our lives.
That's a devastating moment for several reasons, but it makes you wonder if, in a sense, he's writing the whole book to her, but it feels like, as you say, it's more since the birth of Dmitri. These are the things that, depending on how you take them, affect everything. I mean, Portnoy's Complaint, nobody remembers it. It was a book by Philip Roth. You read the whole book, and then the very last line, you realize that he's telling this all to his therapist or psychiatrist, and that all of what you've been reading has been his tortured self-confession. And he holds that off till the very end. So when I hit that line where he's suddenly addressing Vera, in one place I was talking about how strange, so alluring to have photographs in a memoir, photographs from the life. But as I'm reading the memoir, I'm immersed in the language world of that life. And to encounter suddenly, they are static, black and white, a photograph, it raises a whole sort of reality question. It throws me a little bit because the photograph is not from the same stream as the prose.
Yeah.
And by the same token, if I'm reading along and suddenly he turns his head and is addressing his wife, that too, that was a moment that very much threw me, because it changed the reality status.
Yeah.
It gave it a different possibility of intimacy because, Nabokov is an arch and, carefully constructed writer. And so there is deep formalism of the way he treats language and making scenes and so on. So when he suddenly turns at this moment of that incredible intimacy, none of us will, that really is, it's the collision of two kinds of sensibility. One is intimate, personal, and the other is I don't know, memoiristic, quasi-objective, whatever. Fortunately, or unfortunately, he leaves it there. He doesn't then pick that up. So one does forget, because he quickly falls back into the regular register.
Yeah, there are just little moments here and there where it's things are addressed to her without being explicit, or addressed to another person. But yeah, it's like we say, it's interesting seeing that in an author for whom nothing is accidental.
Yes. Oh, well said.
Yeah. He's also an author who at one point says, "I confess I do not believe in time," which
yeah.
There are things that nothing's accidental, but also not everything is we'll say truthful, I suppose. But in talking about your own life and the move, and we did catch up last year during the insane run of April and May when we were all dealing with the pandemic. What's the past year taught you about yourself and the world? And do you think would this book be appreciably different if you had started it in August of 2020 as opposed to 2019?
The second question first, I don't think so.
Okay.
Because I think the whole book basically comes out of my long-term subjectivity. It's the relation I've had with the author in the book for, decades. And it's bounded by a kind of, immersed privacy, both of reading and of writing. And so the COVID world, I don't think enters into that particular piece of writing. As for how it has affected me in general, so many different ways. And I'm going to try to separate off a sort of thing that went in parallel with, the spread and increase of COVID, which was the ever growing sense of the, rampant cruelty and, I don't need to restate what Trump might mean to a person like me, but it's almost inseparable from the year in COVID is the year in dealing with COVID publicly. And then the restrictions imposed. Obviously, everyone drew away from their social structures pretty much or changed them up radically. Certainly, much more, it opened up a much larger sense of privacy and, aloneness, which I don't think is a bad thing. The other thing, though, the thing that haunts me and that I've been trying to think through and write about is the recognition which came gradually after a few months and then began to intensify, had to do with no going back. Mm-hmm. There will be no rejoining. It's going to be, all is going to be changed and different. But I think we still, many of us, live with the kind of magic thinking expectation that, in a couple of months, the vaccine will have tamed it and everything will, just the music will start up again and the restaurant doors will be open. And I don't think that's going to be the effect. I think it has thrown something very very ominous into our lives. And it's not just that, because everything now seems to be moving in a more collective stream. So, climate.
Sure.
And I just don't think, I think where we will be if and when it goes away, we will suddenly find ourselves addressing the outlook for the world in a way which we simply didn't until this happened. I mean, more seriously even than now, more seriously than particular government initiatives, but existentially.
I mean, I was at a viewing, which is not my religion's thing, for the father of one of my best friends yesterday, and I just couldn't cope being in a room with people. It was really, we're all masked. Everybody was good in that respect, but there was just this sense of like, I don't even know what the reentry is going to be like. And I'm sure for normal people, they're fine with all this, that they've been much less diligent than I have about, avoiding all human contact. But I don't see who we are after this or how we look at how different people responded. On top of that, like through my day job stuff, all the business travel, all the things that we took for granted about how the world works.
Yes.
In order to do business, to manufacture, in my case, manufacture drugs and vaccines and all that stuff. All those things are off the table and were instantly taken off the table. And I've been asking the members of my trade association, like, how are you adjusting to business development, to working with customers, developing clients, figuring out, who can come to the facility to audit it. And they're like, yeah, everything's changed and we don't know what we're keeping. And I know that's a smaller existential framework than you're talking about, but it's a micro scale of what everything can be after this.
I think there's another really central and big thing, which is, I mean, I have known and written about this notion that we've been inexorably moving away from analog for quite a long time into the sort of systemic digital sphere, the virtual sphere. I think this event was the kind of thing that kicked it over the wall. I mean, it was tending, but I think almost every area of human endeavor has taken a very big step further into that way of doing things. And
so I was ahead of the curve with calling this virtual memories, huh?
There you go. Oh, absolutely. No. And that's where I sort of end up in the book. I have that last, I'm concluding some kind of postscript. But when I really asked myself, and that's where this relates to your question of what writing this book might have taught me. I had to at some point say, well, here are all the reasons that I really pull toward Nabokov and really take so much from him. But there's always this feeling of the something else. I haven't named it. There's a bigger, more intangible, more elusive thing. And then it just sort of came to me. It seemed as obvious as could be. He is kind of the exaggerated epitome of individuality and idiosyncrasy. His language manifests it. He is so resolutely one person living a life. And, the thing that drives his prose is its hyper attentiveness. And I realized that what I have been psychologically at war with for decades now is, not at war with, I've been experiencing my fear and growing conviction that we are leaving the sphere of the capital I and moving into a much more collectivized system. I mean, everything we need to do in our lives now introduces us or compels us to take part in a system with its own rules of engagement, which are very specific, and they dictate how you're going to operate within that, your codes, your pins, your fields, your everything. And this is true across every aspect of life, whether it's, bill paying, insurance, banking, anything is now subject to a system that forces you to bend to it. And then at the same time, interpersonally, I mean, more and more and more, obviously, especially during this period, we are finding and keeping our bonds virtually. And it just seems like in the last 10, 12 months, we have taken a significant step out of the world that I recognize as the world I grew up in. I think I write about that a little bit. And that, like earlier, the idea of greatness as a value was being depreciated for a host of reasons. I think the idea of individuality has lost its primacy. It used to be kind of an ideal almost. And I'd say even in the 70s and the whole culture of self-development and self-expression and it kind of self-realization, all the movements that tended to have you finding yourself wherever that self was, that's kind of off screen now. It seems like so much is by committee, by virtue of likes and forwards and
retweets and
retweets. We're living in a different atmospheric vibration, and as Milan Kundera said, he has great titles, but Life is Elsewhere, I think, was one of his titles, along with The Unbearable Lightness of Being. So those two actually kind of go side by side.
Laughter and forgetting. Yeah.
And that too. I've already forgotten why I'm laughing, but yeah.
Well, that's of a piece, and I've talked about this with some cartoonists, like independent cartoonists back in the 80s and 90s when I was coming up. They would make mini comics and zines, these smaller handmade, run off at a Kinko's and just mail them out. And then you would get a letter or a postcard from someone 3 months later about, how much they loved the issue. And that was your feedback.
Yeah.
And a lot of these guys are like, I don't know if I would have become as good a writer, artist, etc., as I've become if I was making these things for Tumblr, Facebook, etc., where it's the instant feedback loop. You would start making art that was getting people to respond instantly with a click, as opposed to sitting down, writing a postcard, putting a stamp on it, and mailing it out to me, months later. And and none of them want to sound like, back when I was young and you goddamn kids. That's part of it. Like I
think that'll become hip again.
I get stuff now. I'm so happy that I get postcards from people about the zine and other stuff. I got an editor who writes me almost weekly, just a couple of words about like the last episode and, a suggestion for someone I should talk to. And I'm like, it's so nice. And of course, like you, I've saved all of them. Don't throw anything out. And no one will care. Someone will have to burn all this stuff, but I saved it all. So.
It just means you can't move. Yeah, you've been in that house for most of your life. You can't leave. That's your house.
I rebuilt the downstairs, had the downstairs rebuilt into a library. And the guy who was doing it, the contractor, was like, oh, and right here you could put a big flat screen. This would be great for a man cave. I'm like, I said, I don't think you
wet bar. Yeah.
This is a library. Nobody will ever, there will never be no TV down here. No one will buy this place thinking, oh my God, there's bookshelves everywhere. They're going to rip all this out the moment they move in and put the TV here. But for now, this is going to be Gil and his tomb. So
I will confess that if I'm watching the evening news, as I have been in the last year, the various pundits and their guests, I spend most of my time not listening, but tilting my head sideways, trying to make out the titles of the books behind them.
Oh, you don't understand. Right before the insurrection happened on January 6th, I got interviewed by the Today Show. And Basically, I was quoted in the Wall Street Journal a few days before about a vaccine manufacturing staffing issue. They read it, wanted to interview me about it. And it was a day later. So it was that Wednesday at noon before the insurrection. And I pivoted my desk 90 degrees because the way it's currently configured, the webcam just shows like the whole room behind me. Turned it 90 degrees so the bookshelves were directly behind me, and then stacked them with all of these obscure titles, artists, cartoonists, and everything just in case. They haven't aired it yet because, of course, the world ended. But I was just sitting there like, I am going to get every obscure. I'm getting Tom Tomorrow's, Sparky the Penguin right in the background next to my head. If anyone does what you and I both do, they're going to be so fucking confused. They look, why does that guy have all of these books behind him? I don't understand.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've noticed in my study, the most popular book to be found in the background of the CNN and MSNBC talking heads is Robert Moses.
Oh, Power Broker.
Power Broker. Everyone's got it somewhere. That's the new game. Find the power broker. Never mind what's going on in the world.
Well, the other side of the shelf, it's split in two, and the other side I kept normal because bottom shelf is Shakespeare, next one up is the ancient Greeks, next one up is the ancient Romans, and the top shelf is Philip Roth from beginning to end. And I thought, those can stay. Those will also freak out anyone who's like, why does a pharmaceutical lobbyist have all of ancient literature and Philip Roth standing behind it? Whatever.
Yeah.
If it ever airs, we'll see. But, that was, I figured if I'm going to be on, I am going to make some sort of bookshelf impression on these people. But that's what I was wondering about moving, that sense of what you take and what you don't take. I've gone through culls over the years, but
I mean, I could right now, I'm not adept at doing this. And if we were on Zoom, I could pick up my laptop and walk you through the house, and all you would see are Home Depot square book size boxes everywhere. And now I have to go through. My wife said, well, you better mark where they're going to go. And I realized, oh shit, I just put them all in there. And so now I have to get, big bright labels to put on,
Was that part of the new home search? Was it partly, was it a criteria when you were looking for the new place as to how it was going to accommodate the books?
It was kind of a basic presumptive criterion, but when we found the house that we both fell for, the feature really was on the second floor, an enormous study, wall-to-wall built-in bookcases.
Sweet.
I mean, one could have all of one's books in one place, which is unthinkable, or has been unthinkable. And if I have a single fantasy about next week, once we are physically there, it's going to be sitting and lovingly putting this book here and putting my Robert Museals together instead of all over hell, and and apply that to so many other authors just to see it. And then you can visualize your inner landscape. Formerly it's been in about 9 bookcases in different parts of the house, but this will be me. That's it. Yeah. That's what I've picked and decided on, and now I just got to read them.
Sven, I will leave you to it because that's exactly the position I want to be in life too.
All right.
Thanks so much for coming on again.
Absolutely.
I really
this was a great pleasure, as it has been every time.
And that was Sven Birkerts. Go check out his new book, Vladimir Nabokov's Speak Memory, bookmarked, from IG Publishing. That's IG. It is a joy, so I hope you give it a read after you've read Nabokov's memoir. And go check out Sven's other collections and his memoir. He's a really wonderful writer, very thoughtful, and brings a great deal of intelligence to reading and the world in which we live. Now, you can follow Sven on Twitter at Sven Birkerts, which is SvenBirkerts. Birkerts, and on Instagram at Cyberbirk, which is CYBERBIRK. He does really neat little epigrams on Twitter and posts lovely images and photos he takes on Instagram. So give both of those a follow. And there'll be links to those in the show and episode notes for this one. Now, this is the time where I used to ask people for money as a form of support for the podcast. I'd rather you just send me a postcard, write me a letter, maybe an email, or call my Google Voice number, which is 973-869-9659, and tell me what you like about the show, what you don't like about the show, who you want to see me record with, books I should read, books we should foist off on other people to read. Anyway, that's the sort of support I'm looking for. If you have money to spare, then I suggest you find the GoFundMes, Kickstarters, Patreons, Indiegogos, whatever, for artists and non-artists you'd like to help support. Or, and preferably, find institutions in need, food banks, freedom funds. There are a lot of places that can use your assistance right now, and there are a lot of ways that you can help fix the world. So if you're in a position to help, please do. Now, I still have about 30 copies left of the first issue of my first zine, Haiku for Business Travelers. I am kind of close on issue number 2, but you know me, I'm always hemming and hawing about that stuff, and now I've got to learn how to draw. Anyway, if you're interested, it is free. So just email me, drop me a line, whatever, and I will send you a copy. You can kick in a few bucks for postage and production if you want, but not necessary. This is what I do for love. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You should visit my archives to check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and learn more about his art and painting. And you can listen to his music at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. And that's MAY, the number 4, TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at vmspod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. You've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.